Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're going to dim the lights, settle into our most comfortable listening positions, and embark on a rather peculiar journey into the annals of history. Forget your worries. Let the gentle drone of historical oddities lull you into a state of serene contemplation. Tonight, we're going to talk about something a little epidermal, a bit uncomfortable, perhaps, but in that fascinating historical sort of way that makes you go, well, that happened. So, find your favorite blanket, maybe a warm drink, and let's just drift. Tonight, we're dipping our toes into the surprisingly elaborate and frankly quite squishy world of the Aztec Empire. Specifically, we're going to meander through the rather niche topic of one of their more distinctive rituals. Now, when you hear Aztec, you might think of pyramids, fierce warriors, or perhaps human sacrifice. And yes, you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But tonight, we're focusing on a particular flavor of that, one that involves priests, a goddess, and a rather unfortunate incident with a princess's skin. Because why have a regular ritual when you can have a flaying ritual, right? Of course. So, let's set the scene, shall we? We're talking about Mesoamerica, sometime before the Spanish decided to drop by and completely rearrange everything. The Aztecs, or the Mexica as they called themselves, were busy building an impressive empire, complete with complex social structures, intricate religious beliefs, and a pantheon of gods that demanded quite a lot of attention. And by attention, I mean offerings, sometimes rather grisly ones. Tonight, our star deity is Xipe Totec, which, for those of you keeping score at home, translates rather charmingly to Our Lord the Flayed One. Now, that's a name that really sets the mood, doesn't it? Very evocative. Xipe Totec was a pretty important guy in the Aztec spiritual lineup. He was the god of agriculture, fertility, regeneration, the seasons, gold, silversmiths, and warfare. Basically, an all-rounder. He was associated with the renewal of the earth, the shedding of the old to make way for the new, much like a snake sheds its skin, which, makes perfect sense for a god named Our Lord the Flayed One. The symbolism is just chef's kiss. So, if you wanted your crops to grow, your warriors to be victorious, or simply to ensure the sun kept doing its thing, you paid your respects to Xipe Totec. And those respects often involved, well, flaying. Now, before anyone gets too worked up, let's be clear. This wasn't just some random act of cruelty for cruelty's sake. In the Aztec worldview, everything had a purpose, especially religious rituals. The flaying was meant to symbolize the renewal of the land, the shedding of dry husks, the blossoming of new life. It was, in their minds, a vital act of cosmic maintenance. The priests, by donning the skin of a sacrificed individual, were literally embodying Xipe Totec, becoming living conduits for his regenerative power. It's a very direct form of cosplay, you might say, though perhaps not one that would catch on at your average comic book convention. The ritual itself was quite an event, usually performed during the festival of Tlacaxipoalsli, which means the flaying of men. Very straightforward, those Aztecs. This festival took place during the second month of the Aztec calendar, roughly corresponding to our late February and early March. It was a time when the dry season was giving way to the rains, and the earth was preparing for new growth. So the symbolism of shedding old skin for new life was particularly potent then. Now, who got to be the star of this particular show? Well, usually it was war captives. The Aztecs were pretty keen on taking prisoners for sacrifice, seeing it as a way to feed the gods and ensure the cosmic balance. These captives, often brave warriors from rival tribes, were brought to Tenochtitlan, the bustling capital, and held for these important occasions. And for the flaying ritual, they were, let's say, volunteered to represent the old, dying skin of the earth. The sacrifice itself often began with the captive being led to the top of a temple pyramid, where priests would perform the standard heart extraction, a swift, practiced affair, no doubt. But for Xipe Totec, that was just the appetizer. The main course, for the priests anyway, was what came next. The body would then be carefully flayed, and by carefully, I mean with a certain level of skill that suggests extensive practice, because you want that skin to come off in as complete and usable a piece as possible, right? For ceremonial purposes, of course. Once the skin was removed, it wasn't just discarded. Oh no, that would be wasteful. Instead, it was worn by the priests of Xipe Totec for 20 days. Yes, you heard that right. 20 days. Imagine the smell. Imagine the texture. This was not a job for the faint of heart, or indeed the faint of nose. The priest, adorned in this macabre garment, would parade through the streets, perform dances, and generally embody the god. It was a powerful visual, no doubt, and deeply symbolic for the Aztec people. The decaying skin represented the dry, old earth, and the priest wearing it was a living prayer for the new, fertile season to come. This brings us, rather elegantly, to our specific tale tonight, the unfortunate fate of a Tlaxcalan princess. The Tlaxcalans were a formidable rival to the Aztecs, and their relationship was, shall we say, complicated. Lots of warfare, lots of captive-taking on both sides, so it wasn't entirely surprising that a Tlaxcalan noble, or even a princess, might find herself in the hands of the Aztecs. But this particular princess's story stands out because it involved a particularly high-stakes diplomatic maneuver, which, as these things often do in history, went spectacularly, tragically wrong. The story goes that the Tlaxcalans, in an attempt to forge a peace or perhaps a strategic alliance with the Aztecs, sent one of their princesses as an offering, a rather significant offering, one might say. This wasn't just a random captive, this was a woman of high birth, a symbol of her people. The idea, presumably, was to cement a new relationship through marriage or some other form of ritualistic adoption into the Aztec royal family. A pretty standard play in ancient diplomacy, really. Here's our princess, let's be friends. Now, the Aztecs, being the Aztecs, had a somewhat different interpretation of friendly gesture. They saw the princess not as a bride or an ally, but as a particularly prestigious offering to their gods. And guess which god was feeling particularly hungry for renewal that season? That's right, Xipe Totec. Because why have a peace treaty when you can have an extremely potent ritual sacrifice that also sends a clear message about who's boss? Always doubling down those Aztecs. So, the Tlaxcalan princess, instead of being welcomed into the royal household, found herself prepared for the festival of Tlacaxipahualistli. Can you imagine the dawning horror? One minute, you're a pawn in a high-stakes diplomatic game. The next, you're slated to become the embodiment of agricultural renewal, a pretty significant career change, and not exactly one with a lot of upward mobility. Her sacrifice was undoubtedly a grand affair, fitting for someone of her stature. Taken to the temple, heart extracted, and then the flaying. This was a particularly poignant and politically charged act, the flaying of a Tlaxcalan princess by Aztec priests in honor of Xipe Totec was not just a religious ritual, it was a potent symbol of Aztec dominance and a stark warning to their rivals. This is what happens when you send us your best, it seemed to say. We make a coat out of them. And then, of course, a priest of Xipe Totec donned her skin. Imagine that. A priest wearing the flayed skin of a foreign princess parading through the streets of Tenochtitlan for 20 days. The symbolism was layered and, frankly, chilling. It was a physical manifestation of victory, of religious devotion, and a very public declaration of power. And for the Tlaxcalans, when word inevitably got back to them, it must have been an absolute slap in the face. Their diplomatic gesture had been not just rejected, but twisted into a grotesque display of contempt and power. Now, you might be thinking, surely this led to some unpleasantness. And you'd be absolutely right. The Tlaxcalans were understandably furious. This wasn't just a slight, it was a profound insult, a desecration of their royal line, and a blatant act of aggression. The supposed peace overture had backfired in the most spectacular and tragic way imaginable. This incident, among many others, only deepened the animosity between the Aztecs and the Tlaxcalans, an animosity that would later prove to be a crucial factor in the Spanish conquest, because when Cortés and his motley crew showed up, guess who was more. So, we've left the incense-heavy temples of Babylon behind, and we're drifting forward in time, landing softly in the marbled halls of the 16th and 17th centuries. We're moving from a culture that used ritual to connect with the gods to a culture that used marriage to collect real estate. And no one, and I mean no one, was better at collecting real estate, or worse at biological diversity, than the House of Habsburg. You've probably seen the portraits. They're hanging in the Prado or the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and they all have that look. It's a look that says, I own half the known world, but I find it physically difficult to chew a piece of toast. This was the Habsburg jaw, or more scientifically, mandibular prognathism. It's what happens when your family tree doesn't have any branches and is instead just a very long, very sad pole. The Habsburgs had a motto, let others wage war, thou, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did. They married their cousins, their nieces, and their second cousins twice removed, until the family reunions were basically just a mirror image of the dinner table. They did this because they were obsessed with purity. They didn't want their lands, Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, chunks of Italy, leaking out to other families. But in their quest to keep the bloodline pure, they accidentally turned it into a bit of a genetic cul-de-sac. Let's talk about the poster child for this era of dynastic awkwardness, Charles II of Spain. Now, poor Charles is often described by historians as unfortunate, which is a very polite way of saying he was a walking medical miracle. He was the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, who were uncle and niece. Because of centuries of previous inbreeding, Charles was actually more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. His genetic coefficient was off the charts. Charles was born in 1661, and from the moment he arrived, it was clear that things were a bit wonky. He didn't speak until he was 4, he didn't walk until he was 8, and that famous jaw? In Charles, it reached its final form. His lower jaw protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet. He couldn't chew his food properly, which led to chronic digestive issues. He was also known to drool quite a bit, which is a tough look when you're supposed to be the most powerful man in Christendom. The court of Madrid at this time was a strange, silent place. It was obsessed with etiquette. There were rules for how many steps you could take towards the king and who was allowed to touch his water glass. And in the middle of all this rigid golden splendor was Charles, a man who spent most of his time being exorcised because the court doctors were convinced his physical ailments were the result of sorcery. Yes, they actually called him El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because surely the reason the king is sickly and has a difficult time focusing isn't the 300 years of marrying his own relatives. No, it must be a malicious hex cast by a rival. It's a classic case of historical gaslighting. It's not the DNA, Charles. It's definitely a ghost. The daily life of Charles II was a slow-motion tragedy. He was treated like a fragile glass doll. He wasn't allowed to study too hard because the doctors thought the mental strain would break him. He wasn't allowed to play too roughly. He mostly just wandered the palace, playing with dwarfs and pets, while his mother and various juntas actually ran the crumbling Spanish Empire. And yet, there's something almost sweet about him in the records. He wasn't a tyrant, he wasn't cruel, he was just a very tired, very sick man who was born into a job he could never possibly do. He was married twice, once to Marie Louise of Orleans and once to Maria Anna of Neuburg, but unsurprisingly, he couldn't produce an heir. The accounts of his first marriage are particularly melancholy. Marie-Louise was a vibrant French princess who was understandably horrified to find herself married to a man who struggled to hold a conversation and looked like a melting wax sculpture. But over time, they reportedly developed a genuine, quiet affection for each other. When she died, Charles was devastated. It was one of the few times he showed a spark of deep human emotion. But the machinery of state doesn't care about grief. They immediately married him off again to Maria Anna, who was much more formidable character. She spent most of her time arguing with Charles's mother and trying to influence the succession, while Charles's health continued to spiral. By the end of his life, Charles was a wreck. He suffered from hallucinations, seizures, and a laundry list of other ailments. He died at the age of 38, looking like an old man. When the doctors performed an autopsy, which was a grisly public affair back then, they claimed his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, and his head was full of water. It's a hyperbolic description, of course, but it captures the vibe. Charles II was the physical embodiment of a dynasty that had simply run out of steam. But the Habsburgs weren't the only ones playing this game. Let's float over to the chilly, opulent courts of Russia, where the Romanovs were dealing with their own version of genetic destiny. While the Habsburgs had the jaw, the Romanovs eventually had the royal malady, hemophilia. Now, this didn't start with them. It started with Queen Victoria of England, the grandmother of Europe. Victoria was a carrier of the gene, and because she married her children off to every royal house from Spain to Prussia, she effectively seeded the continent with a ticking biological bomb. In Russia, this bomb went off in the form of Alexei Nikolaevich, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II. He was the long-awaited heir, the sunbeam of the family. But he was born with hemophilia, meaning even a small bruise could lead to internal bleeding that lasted for days, causing him agonizing pain. This is where the story shifts from genetically awkward to deeply dysfunctional. Because the Tsar and the Tsarina were so desperate to keep their son's illness a secret, they became increasingly isolated. They didn't want the Russian public to know the heir to the throne was broken. This isolation created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a man who is the MVP of weird historical side characters, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian monk who claimed to have healing powers. Whether through hypnosis, sheer charisma, or just by telling the doctors to stop giving the boy aspirin, which we now know thins the blood and makes hemophilia worse, Rasputin seemed to be the only one who could stop Alexei's bleeding. Imagine the scene. A dark, velvet-draped room in the Winter Palace. A young boy is screaming in pain. The most powerful couple in Russia are on their knees, weeping, and in walks this unwashed, wild-eyed monk from the wilderness who whispers to the child and somehow makes the pain stop. It's no wonder Tsarina Alexandra thought he was a saint sent by God. But the Russian nobility, they just saw a dirty peasant whispering in the empress's ear. This led to a spiral of rumors, scandals, and eventually the complete collapse of the monarchy. all because a gene didn't copy itself correctly in a nursery in London decades ago. It's a strange butterfly effect kind of tragedy. A tiny hiccup in a protein led to the end of a 300-year-old empire. There's a common thread here, whether we're looking at the sagging jaw of Charles II or the bruised joints of Alexei Romanov. These people were victims of their own status. They were told they were superior, chosen by God, and physically better than the common folk. But the irony is that the common folk, with their diverse gene pools and lack of cousin marriages, were infinitely more robust. The peasants in the field might have been poor, but they usually could chew their bread, and their blood clotted when they scraped a knee. The highest in the land were often the most fragile. It makes you wonder about the mindset of these royals. Did they look in the mirror and think, yes, this is what greatness looks like, or did there be a quiet, nagging fear that they were fading away? We have letters from some of these figures where they complain about their health with a sort of weary resignation. They didn't see it as a genetic failing. They saw it as a heavy crown they were forced to wear. And as we settle deeper into the night, let's move away from the medical charts and look at the more personality-driven disasters. Because while genes can make you sickly, it takes a special kind of upbringing to make you truly, spectacularly dysfunctional. Next, we're going to look at the Mad King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He wasn't a victim of inbreeding in the same way Charles II was, but he was certainly a victim of his own imagination. He's the man who built the fairy tale castles you see in Disney movies, but he did it while slowly losing his grip on reality and his kingdom's finances. He's the patron saint of people who would rather live in a dream than deal with a cabinet meeting. So, take a deep. So we've arrived at the grand finale of the Habsburg genetic experiment. If the Habsburg family tree were a roadmap, by the late 17th century, it wasn't so much a set of branching paths as it was a very tight, very confusing cul-de-sac. And living at the very end of that cul-de-sac was Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. If ever there was a man who was the human personification of too much of a good thing, the good thing here being royal blood, it was him. Charles was born in 1661, and from the moment he arrived, the court was concerned. You see, while a normal person has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and 8 great-grandparents, Charles's family tree had folded in on itself so many times that he actually had fewer ancestors than a common peasant. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been siblings. His father, Philip IV, was his mother's uncle. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was her husband's niece. Because, of course, why look for a spouse in another country when you can just look across the dinner table? Charles was known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. People at the time literally thought he was a victim of sorcery because they couldn't fathom how a human being could be born with such a catastrophic laundry list of ailments. But it wasn't magic, guys. It was just basic biology screaming for a timeout. He had the Habsburg jaw to an extreme degree. It was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth didn't even meet, which meant he couldn't chew his food properly. He basically just gulped. He also had a tongue so large that he barely spoke, and when he did, he was almost impossible to understand. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4, and he didn't walk until he was 8. Even then, he was frail, prone to fainting, and suffered from chronic digestive issues. He was quite literally a man built out of genetic errors. But the real tragedy, at least for the Spanish Empire, was that Charles was also intellectually disabled and, most importantly for a monarch, completely infertile. He was married twice, but neither union produced an heir. His first wife, Marie Louise of Orleans, reportedly wept when she found out she had to move to Spain to marry him. Can you blame her? She was a vibrant, beautiful French princess, and he was Charles. She died young, and his second wife, Mariana of Neuburg, spent most of her time faking pregnancies and arguing with his mother. It was a domestic disaster draped in velvet and gold. Charles spent his days playing with toys in the palace or visiting the corpses of his ancestors in the royal pantheon. He once had the coffin of his first wife opened so he could look at her one last time. It's that kind of dark, weird melancholy that only 17th century Spanish royalty could really pull off. He eventually died in 1700, aged only 38, looking like a man of 80. His autopsy, and yes, they did one, recorded that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, and his head was full of water. A bit dramatic, perhaps, but it paints a picture. His death sparked the War of the Spanish Succession because he left no children, just a giant power vacuum and a map of Europe that everyone wanted to redraw. All that effort to keep the bloodline pure ended up being the very thing that extinguished the Spanish Habsburg line forever. Talk about an ironic twist. The mad queens and the sad princes. But the Habsburgs didn't have a monopoly on royal dysfunction. Let's drift north a bit, toward the windy plains of Russia and the foggy palaces of England. While the Habsburgs were busy with their jaws, other royals were dealing with what they called the royal malady. Take Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, for instance. A lovely woman, very cultured, very intelligent, but she had a slight obsession. She was absolutely convinced that as a child she had swallowed a grand piano made of glass. Yes, a glass piano. This meant she had to walk through doorways sideways and move with extreme caution, because if she bumped into anything, she might shatter. Imagine being a servant in that palace, trying to dust the furniture while a princess edges past you, terrified of internal musical breakage. It's a quiet, fragile kind of madness. Then there was King George III of England. Now, George gets a bad rap for losing the American colonies, but honestly, he had a lot on his plate. He likely suffered from porphyria, a blood disorder that can cause blue urine, which is a fun party trick, and episodes of intense mania. During his bouts of illness, he'd talk for hours until he foamed at the mouth, or he'd try to shake hands with an oak tree because he thought it was the King of Prussia. He wasn't mad in the way we think of movie villains. He was just a confused, sick man who wanted to garden and talk to trees. The treatment for this, because it was the 18th century and medical science was basically guess and check, involved putting him in a straitjacket and blistering his skin with mustard poultices to draw out the humors. It's no wonder he didn't get better. He spent his final years blind and deaf, wandering around Windsor Castle in a purple dressing gown, talking to imaginary friends. A bit of a lonely end for the man who once ruled the world's most powerful empire. The weight of the crown. It's easy to look back at these figures and laugh at the absurdity, the glass pianos, the giant jaws, the tree shaking, but there's a certain quiet tragedy to it all. These people were born into roles they never asked for, in bodies that were failing them, under the immense pressure of divine right. They were told they were chosen by God, yet they were often the most physically and mentally fragile people in their kingdoms. They lived in spectacular palaces, surrounded by the finest art and food, but they were often lonely, isolated by their status and their ailments. Their lives were a series of rituals and expectations, a long, slow parade toward a tomb in a basement. In a way, their stories are a reminder that no amount of gold or pedigree can protect you from the messy reality of being human. Or in the case of the Habsburgs, the messy reality of being slightly too related to your spouse. As we drift toward the end of our journey tonight, just think about the silence of those old palaces, the sound of a glass piano that isn't there, the muffled speech of a king who can't close his mouth, and the rustle of a princess's skin being worn by a priest in a distant sun-soaked city. History is a long, strange, and very sleepy dream.